The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Lysett. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies here at the University of Chicago. And I'd like to thank you for joining us on this beautiful evening for our signature speakers series, The World Beyond the Headlines, featuring acclaimed journalists, scholars, and newsmakers offering in-depth perspectives on matters of public concern. Coming up next in The World Beyond the Headlines on Thursday, May 27th, will be a talk with Anoop Kapale of the Washington Post on migrant labor in the Gulf states. We'd really like to thank our co-sponsors tonight, the International House Global Voices Author Series and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. For more information about World Beyond the Headlines or any of our programs, visit cis.uchicago.edu or visit us on Facebook. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome Chris Woods to the University of Chicago. Chris Woods is a widely published journalist focused on conflict and national security issues. A former senior BBC producer, he's authored some of the key investigations into covert U.S. drone wars. His work has taken him to the terrorist-infested hills of Waziristan, to the urban battlefields of Iraq, and to the conflict zones of Israel and Palestine. He has recently been awarded the prestigious Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism for his investigative work on drones. After Chris's talk, there will be time for Q&A, questions and answers, and a wine and cheese reception will follow. Also, there will be book signing and book sales by the Seminary Co-op on the table just to my left. Right? So please join me in welcoming Chris Woods to the University of Chicago, where he will be speaking on his new book from Oxford University Press, Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you to everyone coming out tonight. I know it's a really glorious evening, so I'm very pleased that you could take the time out. As Mark mentioned, I'm an investigative journalist. That's my background. I've been a journalist for 25 odd years. Drones is an interesting one for me. It's the only subject in my entire career as a journalist where I've specifically focused on one topic for a continuous period of time. And in fact, since late 2010, this is the only subject that I've been focused on. It's been a slightly unusual journey because of that, and as Mark said, it took me to some quite interesting places. I was able to get into Waziristan, for example, in Pakistan, which is one of the wilder parts of that country, where a lot of the drone strikes have been concentrated over the years. The original focus of my investigation was the secret drone wars, the drone wars carried out by the CIA and by special forces in places like Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. And over time, I wanted to put that together, put a book together on the subject. But the more I looked at it, the more I felt that we were missing a fairly big piece of the jigsaw. We were seeing what was happening with the drones only through the prism of what the CIA was doing. And we were missing, I think, the bigger picture. We were missing a broader understanding of the revolution in warfare that armed drones were bringing. 80% of drone strikes actually take place on the regular battlefield in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, where they're governed by the rules of war. They are under full military control, and they may sometimes be a force for good. That might seem a strange thing in war, but there's a legal obligation on combatants to use the least damaging weapon available to them. And drones on occasion might actually represent that weapon. They're slow, they're precise, they can choose the moment at which they strike, and they use very minimal warheads so that they can limit the number of civilians killed in battle. And aerial warfare historically has actually been one of the most dangerous forms of war for civilians on the ground. Aerial warfare has historically been indiscriminate and led to large numbers of civilian deaths. So on the regular battlefield, we've been seeing this major revolution as well, which hasn't really, I think, been reflected in the coverage. And it's in the book, it's a big part of the book. I look at Afghanistan, I look at Iraq, as I say. And also I look at how special forces have been using the drones, and one of the things I was pleased with was to get members of the Special Forces drones community to talk to me. They're quite a discreet group of people, as you can imagine, and a lot of them took a lot of convincing, but they did open up to me. I'm going to read just a few short extracts tonight and try and leave plenty of time for Q&A, because I think people have lots of questions about this form of warfare. But I thought I'd start with an extract that talks about the use of drones on the regular battlefield. Back in 2004, after the British and US invasion of Iraq, the disastrous British and American invasion of Iraq, one city in particular became the epicenter of the Sunni insurgency, and that was a city called Fallujah. As you might recall, there were some very bloody fights between Islamic militants and the US Marine Corps. There were two big battles for Fallujah. And this is the perspective, not from the air of the drone war, but actually from a US Marine on the ground. By 2004, Sunni-dominated Fallujah had become the epicenter of Iraq's growing insurgency. Marine Corps Sergeant Matthew Marden was assigned with his scout sniper platoon to the southern edges of the city. Our job was to probe what's going on in Fallujah, because the city was completely off limits at that point. There were no friendly military inside the city at all, he recalls. The risk to personnel on the ground were extreme, with a number of Iraqi army operatives captured and executed that summer. With a fresh assault on Fallujah planned for November, Joint Special Operations Command, that's this kind of super elite of American Special Forces, was drafted in to help target and kill key insurgents, among them Ayman al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is the precursor, if you like, of Islamic State today. It was the first incarnation of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Armed drones began playing a key role. And Mardan recalls one night watching a Predator precision strike on the city few had so far witnessed from the ground. A call came in on the radio that there's going to be a Predator attack. I remember another guy in our team started freaking out. What's a Predator attack? What's going on? Thinking there was going to be incoming fire. And we were like, no, a Predator, a drone. So let's sit here and watch. So we just sat for 10 minutes using night vision. We could hear a buzzing about 1 kilometer up in the air. You could hear the thing, but you couldn't see it. A Hellfire missile hit a target. It didn't make a huge explosion, but it definitely made an impact. You could tell it was very specific, a precision attack. Our platoon commander, who was with us at the time, goes, "That's the future, gents. That's probably what's going to replace all of us." And I like that story because it gives you this insight into the revolution that was taking place with drones. What would have happened before that Predator? They may have called in an F-16 or a B-1 or an A-10. I mean, all these you know, alphanumeric aircraft, but the point about all of them is they used big bombs, and they generally would have destroyed the entire building, possibly the entire street, depending on what weapons they were using. This new weapon was carrying out this precision strike. But of course, it's the use of drones away from the hot battlefield in Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, as I say, which is the most controversial. And we saw just a week or two ago when President Obama had to stand up and apologize for the fact that the CIA had killed an American citizen, a civilian, Mr. Warren Weinstein. The drones have this extraordinary ability to crash their way into the national narrative at the moment. I can't think of another weapon that has the ability to make politicians, generals, CIA chiefs and so on stand up and have to sometimes acknowledge actions around a single weapon system. This is a kind of an unusual situation that we're in at the moment. And it was interesting for me researching the book just how personally involved President Obama in particular had become in the drone campaign. You may have read stories a few years back about how Obama would be signing off, for example, on the kill orders, the assassinations that were taking place of terror suspects in these places. But it turns out it went a little bit further than that, and this is another extract relating to the killing, what turned out to be the actual killing of an American citizen in Yemen. In early 2011, an elite squadron of Predators flying above Yemen was cleared by the customer, JSOC, to kill US citizen Anwar al-Awlaki. Should they find him, President Obama himself would personally give operators the lethal order. Preacher al-Awlaki had once been a favorite of some US officials, even leading lunchtime prayers at the Pentagon after 9/11. Yet with the disastrous invasion of Iraq, his sermons had become ever more anti-American. Now it was alleged he was a senior al-Qaeda operative, and most wanted posters featuring the gaunt American were plastered inside every ground control station at Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico, home to the Air Force's Special Operations Squadrons. Previous efforts to kill Awlaki dated back to December 2009, before he was even officially classed as a terrorist by Washington. The involvement of Special Forces drone squadrons in Yemen marked a fresh escalation in Barack Obama's secret war. Brandon Bryant, a long-serving sensor operator in the program, records his feelings at the time on hearing that Barack Obama himself would be personally involved. We got direction from some higher up that the president would call our GCS and would issue the order directly to us as a crew if we needed to shoot. That's a little bit thrilling. They wanted people that were responsible, people that would follow orders if the president came to call. And as far as I was concerned, these were bad guys. For Bryant and his colleagues, the involvement of the president was unique. The Air Force had gone to some lengths over the years to keep politicians out of the cockpit. I guess Obama felt it important enough. This guy Awlaki was still an American citizen. The only thing that would have given more respect was if President Obama would have come down himself and pulled the trigger. And for me, I find that remarkable. That there's been a lot of discussion in recent weeks about the killing of Americans in this drone program. I don't think what President Obama was aiming to do there was about bravado. I think he was actually prepared to take the responsibility off the shoulders of those operators by giving them official permission to kill an American without due process, which, as you'll know, is constitutionally a very problematic area. But I think to get that sense of how invested personally Obama has become with this drone campaign, we'd probably have to go back to Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s, who would apparently personally kind of micromanage US Air Force bombings in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So the drones have become bound up with the presidency of Obama as they were bound up with his predecessor as well. But they continue as well to throw up issues which US officials are perhaps not that willing to confront. And I think the biggest issue that these targeted killings, these assassinations away from the battlefield raise are ones of legality. When I travel around and talk about drone strikes, US drone operations, internationally, usually the first question people ask me about is the legality of the strikes. What I find interesting is within the United States, it's usually the last question I'm asked, particularly if there are officials present. The legality of the assassination program, the targeted killing program, has pretty much disappeared from the national discourse here in the US, and I find that interesting. From the UN's perspective, for example, they still view these as what they call extrajudicial killings. And I think of around 200 nations who belong to the United Nations at the moment, I think it's fair to say that 198 of those nations would view killings beyond the hot battlefield, as they're called, as unlawful, except in very particular circumstances. Yet here in the US, that's not discussed anymore. It's accepted that these are lawful. It's asserted that these are lawful all the time. Now, that's not just my position. For the book, I got to speak to plenty of generals and former and serving intelligence officials, diplomats and so on. And one very high-ranking former US intelligence official, I can't identify them, said the following, and I'm quoting him directly: "We are the only country on earth who thinks that we're in a global war with Al-Qaeda and that we have the right to take the fight to the enemy outside of internationally agreed theatres of conflict." So there's always been this recognition within government and within the military intelligence machine here that there are challenges to these drone strikes. But nevertheless, the Bush and Obama administrations have chosen to persevere with them. And I guess the question really comes down to efficacy. You know, why would they risk challenging international opinion? What is it that they're hoping to achieve with these strikes? The efficacy, I think, is there. We can look at how Al-Qaeda was decimated in places like Pakistan. After they were driven from the cities in the wake of 9/11 by arrests, mainly by the CIA, Pakistani intelligence, by the FBI, Al-Qaeda fled to places like Waziristan. These are the previously inaccessible areas of Pakistan that, in fact, have been used to launch attacks on the Russians when they'd occupied Afghanistan in the late 70s and early 80s. The difference that the drones brought is that Waziristan was no longer inaccessible. And drones finally gave the US the capability to chase Al-Qaeda to this territory, which it did, which is exactly what happened. And many of Al-Qaeda's most senior leaders were killed by the drones. There's no doubt about that. It also forced the organization to change the very way that it operated. It went from a high-tech terrorist organization to a low-tech organization communicating by handheld messages literally overnight. And it slowed down Al-Qaeda and eventually helped to destroy it, Al-Qaeda Central, as we might think about it. But there's been a cost to that. And there's also some very questionable strategic fallout from these drone wars that we sometimes don't like to consider. Often when we hear the CIA or the president talking about drones, they're talking about precision, they're talking about precise strikes and clear outcomes. It's not always that way. And I'm going to read you another extract now, which relates to a bombing in Pakistan in 2006. We cannot prove that the CIA carried out this strike, but the circumstantial evidence is very strong. Unfortunately, after 9 years, we still can't get the agency or the US government to confirm whether this was the United States that carried out this action. As you'll see, there are reasons that the US, I think, should be engaging on this particular strike. Maulvi Learkat was headmaster of a seminary for boys in the village of Chenagai in the Bajaur tribal agency. He was also a leader of the TNSM, an Islamist organization founded in 1992 and banned for extremism by Pervez Musharraf's military government. That move led to armed conflict with the state, though by autumn 2006, Islamabad was offering a peace deal to the TNSM in Bajaur. Similar agreements in nearby Waziristan, requiring only that militants no longer target Pakistani troops, had freed up thousands of fighters to join the fast-growing insurgency in Afghanistan. This was one of the problems. Pakistan was making these local peace deals to protect itself, and then these fighters were then going across and killing Americans. It was a real problem. With the deal scheduled for October 30th, Mushtaq Yousafzai, now a local correspondent for NBC News, was one of a select group of journalists invited to Bajaur to witness the signing. On the day beforehand, he'd visited Learkat's madrasa. I couldn't really see many men, though one or two were teachers, he recalls. Most of them were students aged 12 to 17. In the early hours of the next morning, he was woken by a massive explosion. Rushing to the scene, Yousafzai found that a direct hit on the school had caused immense damage. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were many human body pieces, not a single complete body. Everything at the madrasa was shattered. Survivors and villagers helped gather up body parts, and by dawn the death toll stood at 81, most of them reportedly children aged under 17. The only militant confirmed dead by locals was Maulvi Learkat himself, who'd been expected to take part in the signing ceremony. And I go into quite a lot of detail in the book about, there are plenty of witnesses I've been able to track down who the circumstantial evidence was very much that the CIA had been responsible for this strike. Pakistan Army at that time had a secret arrangement with the CIA, which meant that it gave cover to CIA operations in Pakistan and would claim to carry out these strikes itself. In fact, so bad was this particular event that strike, that secret arrangement ended on this night. And subsequently, very senior Pakistani officials have said on the record, it wasn't us, it was the United States. But no US official has ever confirmed this. No US official has said, yes, we accidentally killed 69 children that night. We saw last year the Taliban in Pakistan carried out a horrific massacre on a school in Peshawar. You might remember, it's only a few months ago. They killed 135 children in Pakistan. The impact of that atrocity was devastating on Pakistani society. Within days, Pakistan had reintroduced the death penalty. They'd mounted fresh incursions against the Taliban in huge areas of the country. There was an intolerance of the Taliban and the values that it stood for. And the ripples from that atrocity are still with us, and Pakistan is still coping with those. Now imagine 9 years ago a bombing that killed 69 children, and nobody has ever taken responsibility for that event. Nobody has ever said, we're sorry. No one has ever said why the error took place that night, or indeed whether it was an error, whether it was thought acceptable to carry out that strike to kill the target they were aiming for. I had the opportunity for the book to put the question to a former high-ranking official, did you do it? It was the first chance I think any journalist had had to actually ask that question. Did the CIA carry out the bombing at Chenagai, as past and present officials in Pakistan now insist? If so, it would have been the first covert drone strike under new director Michael Hayden, who'd taken over the agency weeks earlier in June 2006. While admitting that the Chenagai attack could have been us, a former senior US intelligence official told me he had no recollection of that whatsoever. I would have remembered pictures, the narrative, just the whole thing, and I've got nothing on this in my memory. Asked to explain who might therefore be responsible, the former official would only say that maybe it was them, the Pakistanis, and they decided to toss someone else under the bus. I mean, for me, this sort of cuts to the heart of the problem with the 20% of drone strikes that are taking place away from the regular battlefield. It's a secretive war. It's a war whose legality is unclear. It's a war being fought by a civilian intelligence agency built on secrecy. It's an intelligence agency with a lethal air force and no accountability. Over the years, we've seen the CIA do things in places like Pakistan that those in the conventional US military are quite horrified by. I did an investigation a few years ago showing that the CIA, for example, had deliberately targeted first responders in Pakistan, rescuers. So they would carry out a strike. Locals and Taliban would then come forward to rescue the dead and injured, and the CIA would come back and bomb the rescuers at the scene. There's a very well-documented event when the CIA bombed a funeral in Pakistan. It killed a mid-ranking Taliban commander to use the funeral as bait to draw the head of the entire Pakistan Taliban to the funeral. He didn't come. The CIA thought he was there. They bombed the funeral. We think they killed 40 to 50 civilians. These are actions which are morally deeply troubling. And I think they occur because it's a war being run in the shadows by a secret agency without true accountability. And there have been discussions, as I'm sure you've probably seen over the last few days, about whether the drone wars should be transferred to the Pentagon in their entirety. And if I were to give an argument for that, and I think that there are a lot of issues about whether you get more transparency with the military, I do feel that you would get a more moral action by the military than we've seen historically from the CIA. They're better at the moment. They came under great pressure to reduce the number of civilians they killed, for example. But they're not perfect. And I think, it still leaves uncomfortable questions for many people about why the CIA has its own air force now. I called George W. Bush in the book the occasional assassin. And I think that's a fair description of Bush. When the Bush administration began its program of targeted killings, assassinations, it was very ad hoc to start with. They were very cautious about it. We would see strikes once a year, twice a year. It was only really in the last 6 months of Bush's presidency that we saw a steep escalation of these targeted killings. And I think many of us were surprised when Obama came in, and I guess folk expected that the drone strikes might go the same way as torture, rendition, Guantanamo, and be consigned to history when Obama came in. In fact, Obama embraced the drones, and one of his former advisors told me that in his view, Obama and his administration became as addicted to drones as if it was catnip. That they were something that they could use, that they could be seen to engage with, to use on the battlefield, to use off the battlefield. And so we've seen, for example, Obama has carried out, I think, 9 times more drone strikes than Bush in Pakistan, and he expanded the wars to Yemen and to Somalia as well. Is that a good thing? I think that's an interesting question. There is an issue with armed drones, not just the technology and what they're capable of delivering and what they do, but whether drones are lowering the threshold for war right now. I think there's a big question about how drones are being used and whether politicians and generals are seeing them as easy options right now. When the clamour from the public is to do something, they are seen as these risk-free military options. We can be seen to do something, we can take on the enemy, we can achieve things. And I'm just going to end very quickly by mentioning one strike back in 2013. Tactically, the strike, I think you could argue, was a success for special forces who carried it out. They killed a number of mid-ranking al-Qaeda affiliates in Yemen. Strategically, though, you have to look at this event and ask who actually weighed up that strike in the balance and decided that America's interests were being served in the long run by this particular event. You might remember this particular strike. It was the bombing of a wedding convoy in Yemen back in December 2013. The groom's name was Abdullah Mabkut al-Amri. His wife-to-be's name was Wada al-Sarimi. They were both widowed, remarrying for the second time, both in their 40s. They'd met for lunch, the marriage lunch, and then there was a convoy, I think, of about 15 vehicles travelling over a very dusty, windy road to go to the new home that they were going to make together. Halfway along that road, JSOC bombed the convoy and killed around a dozen people in the wedding convoy. The bride was injured. The 25-year-old son of the groom from his first marriage was among those killed. Now, as I say, there were some al-Qaeda, we think, killed in that operation, 3 or 4. The rest appear to have been civilians, non-combatants. JSOC, there was a lot of criticism for that event, and JSOC put it about that they'd had 2 inquiries into the event, both of which had come back and said, no civilians killed, which is often the US line, we don't kill civilians. The Yemen government apparently didn't get the memo, and almost immediately Yemen's, for the province that the strike took place in, both the governor of that province and the military commander of that province publicly apologized to the families of the victims involved, admitted that it was an error, paid out, I think, $150,000 in compensation, and awarded 101 Kalashnikov rifles, which is a Yemen peace offering. But it didn't end there. The UN waded in and attacked the United States for saying that it couldn't carry out killings on Yemen's soil even with the consent of the Yemen government. And eventually Yemen's parliament would vote as a direct consequence of this strike and demand an end to US strikes on its territory. An impotent call, in fact, because the US ignored Yemen's parliament just as it's ignored a similar call by Pakistan's parliament to end the strikes. So you can have these tactical successes, you can kill the bad guys, but it comes back to the bigger question of what are we trying to achieve with the drone strikes away from the hot battlefield? What are the strategic benefits? What are the strategic accomplishments of these secret wars? And I think the answer on that is really open for debate. I wanted to just leave it there, really, to throw it open to questions. I could obviously talk about drones for a very long time. But yeah, any questions? Would anyone like to jump in? Yes, sir.
I think you put it that it becomes easier to use these weapons when there's a cry from the people to do something. Or could it possibly be from salesmen?
That's a good question. I mean, clearly something needs to be done. I mean, you know, Al-Qaeda was a problem, for example, in Pakistan's tribal areas. There was no way to get in there conventionally. I can see the argument for engaging on Al-Qaeda, but more recently, for example, we saw with Libya this demand that we engage, that we deal with Libya. Drones were part of the equation that dealt with Libya. Militarily, we can be very good at dealing with issues. What diplomats, former State Department officials complained to me a lot about when I was writing the book was that what you don't get often with the drone wars is all the stuff that should go with them. You don't get the diplomacy, you don't get the financial investment, you don't get the shoring up of the people we need to hold these countries together. And of course we're in a situation now where there isn't a US embassy in Libya. There isn't a Libya, frankly, at the moment. It's broken up into 3 parts and is pretty much a failed state today. We're very good at delivering the military punch. I think the problem is the focus has become so tightly on counter-terrorism that all the other stuff that should be going with that seems to have fallen away. And that's the criticism I kept hearing, as I say, from diplomats. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm just wondering where the push to do something comes from.
Yeah, I mean, partly it's the war on terror. I mean, we are living in very chaotic times, and you know, the war is expanding. You know, the Middle East is in a very fraught situation at the moment. Drones are a very quick way that you can engage in that kind of environment. In terms of commercial pressures, I mean, there's still only one company makes the Predator and the Reaper drones. They can't make them fast enough. Well, in fact, they stopped making the Predator. It's only the Reaper now. I don't think there's commercial pressure as we think about it. The pressure is all there from the military, from the intelligence community, from the politicians to do something. And the pilots, the operators are under immense stress, actually, because it never stops for them. They're at permanent war, if you like.
Are those sold to other countries also?
No, there's a very, very tight control on armed drone sales. So only the United States and Israel presently have a sophisticated armed drone kind of capability that they build themselves. The US has begun making that available to very close allies. So Britain was allowed to use the Reaper drones from quite early on. France and Germany may now be getting them. Israel will not sell its armed drones to anyone. So it's a very small club that use these weapons at the moment. Yes, sir.
To follow up on that question, so a common thing you hear from opponents is that if you have these indiscriminate killings, you're actually creating more terrorists than you're killing. So you might be making the problem worse in the long run. So again, as you said, where they're moving tactical victories, strategically into losing battle. But however, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that the drone strikes really did cripple Al-Qaeda severely, and so so that seems to have been a strategic victory.
Yeah.
But our new kind of terrorist forces emerging to take Al-Qaeda's place. For instance, is Islamic State as much of a threat to the U.S. as Al-Qaeda was in their capability to carry out terrorist attacks? And is one of the reasons, and our drones, extra battlefield drone strikes, one of the big factors driving recruitment for these newer organizations?
Yeah. Great questions. One former US senior intelligence official told me that they always thought at CIA they had a limited window where they'd be effective with the drone strikes. And he described them in terms of first order, second order, third order effects. First order was killing America's enemies. They anticipated that at some point, second and third order effects would overwhelm those. And I said, well, what are these second and third order effects? The second order effects really surprised me, that they were concerned that America's closest allies would become too uncomfortable with what America was doing. The third order effect was the concern that America would in the end be killing less people with the drones than the drones were themselves recruiting. So the agency itself always was concerned that that point would come. And there's a significant body of opinion within the US military and intelligence communities that says we've passed that point already in the secret wars. I think that's a straightforward strategic choice for the next president, by the way, are they simply less effective than they were 10 years ago? In terms of, are they a recruiter, how are Al-Qaeda adapting and so on? Islamic State is being hit very hard. The last estimate we had, I think they've lost 8,500 fighters so far in coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, but they're very adaptive. And we've seen that Islamic State, for example, tends to launch its major offensives on cloudy days, rainy days, or when there are sandstorms. Why? Because the drones can't operate on those days. So we have a very adaptive enemy that's been living on the other end of armed drones for 14 years now, and they have learned to adapt to them to a significant degree. So we're going to have to adapt to their adaptations, if you like, and that's another area. Yes.
Okay, a couple of questions. First of all, there's a film coming out recently. It's called Good Kill by Andrew Niccol.
Yeah.
If you have seen it, what do you think about the perspective? Second question is a little bit related to one of the if during your investigation you ever encounter examples of, let's say, reverse engineering or hacking of commercial drones, so just like I buy an Amazon drone and I try to convert it.
Yeah.
And since the availability is related to certain fraction of the
The movie Good Kill, it's I don't think it's known about much here, but it's opened in Europe and did quite well. Yeah. Ethan Hawke playing a drone pilot. I haven't seen the film, but I've seen the script, and I think it's very accurate. Actually, I had the real opportunity to talk to drone pilots, operators, intelligence analysts for the book. It was really interesting for me. It was not what I'd expected at all. I think we all bought into this idea of, we're told about the PlayStation mentality. These men and women thousands of miles from the battlefield, remote and cold. What I found was completely the opposite. All the men and women I spoke to who are or have been involved in the drone wars were very engaged. They were very professional. They cared very greatly about the killing of civilians, and some of them were quite messed up by having killed civilians or having to observe things that they had no control over. I tell a story in the book of a young lieutenant on her first drone mission, and she was simply observing 29 of 30 drone missions on the regular battlefield are actually intelligence gathering. They don't end violently. Drones are phenomenal in terms of gathering intelligence. And unfortunately, this poor lieutenant had to witness in high definition video at a fairly low altitude an insurgent vehicle that they were tracking, and in the trunk of that vehicle was a tribal leader. They took him out, they tortured him, they chopped his head off. And she had to watch that on her first ever mission. She broke down. They had to call in the cleric, the priest who was attached to that squadron. She never flew again. And I've had that from a number of people who were there that night, who were brought in, and you know, there is an empathy, I think. It's a remarkable thing about the drone. I describe it in places as the first aerial sniper rifle, because often the operators watch the people they're going to kill for days or even weeks before they then take the kill. So they build this emotional bond with the people that they then go on to target. And that's something unusual in the battlefield. War is quite often about distancing us from the enemy. Drones, even though the operators are thousands of miles away, might actually be the closest people to their targets on the battlefield. And the Air Force is grappling with the psychological implications with this at the moment. What they thought was a positive is not necessarily a positive. And I think it's fair to view the early drone operators as guinea pigs. Nobody really knew the effect that this would have on them, and some of it's not good. I think it would be fair to say. Your other question about spoofing and hacking, Al-Qaeda's put an awful lot of effort into hacking drones, and I'm sure groups like Hezbollah have as well. It's pretty likely the Iranians, for example, spoofed a CIA unarmed drone over Iran a couple of years ago. You might remember there was a drone brought down. Just the fact that that drone landed intact suggests to me that it was spoofed. I don't necessarily think Iran had the technological capability for that. I think Iran may have had some help, because you can bet your bottom dollar that America's colleagues in the United Nations would very much indeed like to get their hands on this technology. It is really, you know, the technological gulf between the US right now and many of its those who it's ideologically opposed to is fairly profound. And what we find is when a predator or a reaper is brought down, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda will get in there very, very quickly to grab, because they're selling it. They're selling it to the highest bidder, and there's a lot of buyers out there apparently. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to mention that movie Good Kill is playing at the Gene Siskel Film Center later this month.
Oh,
So I wanted to put it up.
Yeah. Yes.
Especially in the wake of the Vietnam War, it seems to me that the U.S. military has been attentive to media coverage of war-making and state-sponsored violence, and it continues obviously to the present. The embedded journalists in Iraq are a good example of that. And I'm curious, given the controversial nature and often extra-legal nature of drone attacks and targeted killings, have you seen the CIA attempt to sculpt a public narrative on drones in the United States? As in your own research, in your own talking with senior officials or former officials, did you have to try to weed through an emergent narrative that was produced and maybe even sponsored by the agency?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I've had battles with the CIA going back about 4 years. I mentioned earlier that I did a story showing that they were deliberately targeting rescuers and funeral goers. For that, an anonymous US intelligence official labelled me a friend of Al-Qaeda in the New York Times. This can be a very dirty propaganda war. And in fact, just a couple of days ago, a former head of the CIA was, he used the word scoff to describe groups who are trying to monitor civilian casualties in the wars. Where I've gone head-to-head with the CIA is its manipulation of casualty figures. And there was a period where the CIA was boasting that drones were, quote, the most perfect weapon in the history of warfare. That was their line. And they claimed that for a 20-month period, not a single civilian had died in Pakistan. And I was one of the journalists that challenged them quite aggressively on that. And we, in fact, presented them with evidence of quite a lot of civilians they killed. Drones really do. I do believe that drones significantly reduce the risk to civilians on the battlefield. And you mentioned Vietnam. I give a figure in the book. During the Vietnam War, there were secret bombings carried out by the Air Force, not the CIA, in Laos and Cambodia. 4.75 million tons of explosives was dropped by the Air Force on those two countries, killing a minimum of 100,000 civilians. That's what aerial warfare used to be like. I did the numbers for the CIA's bombings in Pakistan, and my guess is around 350 tons of explosives, not 4.75 million tons. And we think around 400 civilians killed. Now that's still a lot of civilians, but the decrease of an order of magnitude of civilians is extraordinary, the risk to civilians in the battle space. But we haven't got it to zero. That's a lie. And I think the CIA and the White House and the Pentagon need to be called out when we hear them saying they're not killing civilians. I've covered wars for a long time, and wars kill civilians. And next door in Afghanistan, the United Nations, working very closely with ISAF, international forces in Afghanistan, they could never get civilian casualties below about 5% in Afghanistan, despite taking extraordinary measures to reduce the risk to non-combatants and very clear rules of engagement and so on. So the bare minimum with drones, we should expect around 5% civilian casualties. That sounds a lot, but actually 30 years ago we were probably expecting 20% civilian casualties from airstrikes. It's a major move forward. But yeah, the CIA is trying to construct a narrative of perfection that we all need to be challenging, I think. I'm going to take one at the back, sir, but I'll come back to you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a question about other countries. There have been some questions about countries spoofing these drones. Do other countries have their own developing drone programs? And what kind of gap? You said that there is a gap, but what kind of gap is that? I mean, is Russia working on various countries that would be obviously very interested in having their own?
Iran has a reasonably advanced drone program now. Russia has a drone program. It sort of went down a technological back road, really, and had to start again when it had its recent war with Georgia. The only bit of that war Russia lost was the drone war, and Russia's drones were destroyed in seconds in that conflict, so they had to go back to the drawing board. China, very interestingly, China probably, if not really at the same level as Israel and the US right now, might even be ahead at the moment. But then the Chinese are very, very interesting in terms of the drones. They haven't used them in anger yet. And in fact, right now, Russia and China seem to be able to get more mileage out of making trouble for the US at the United Nations by pointing to what they view as the illegality of America's drone operations than actually going down that path themselves. There was a very interesting story a few years ago. There was a very unpleasant incident where some drug smugglers were intercepted by a Chinese inshore patrol boat, and 17 Chinese sailors were murdered. Very unpleasant incident. The drug gang then fled into what's known as the Golden Triangle, a sort of area between Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. And the Chinese government let it be known, they kind of leaked the story through state media, that they considered carrying out a drone strike on these drug folk. But since that was unlawful, they worked with the authorities in Laos, apprehended the men, brought them to trial, convicted them and executed them. And I think that was a very interesting message from China. It was a deliberate message that China was sending, that while they have the same capability as the United States, they're not willing to go down that road of strikes beyond the hot battlefield. So it was quite interesting to see how China played that. They're saying they have the capability, they're just saying they don't want to go where the US has. So. Anyone else? So yes.
So to follow up on that question, I mean, has China actually demonstrated the capability, or is this just grandstanding?
They definitely have the capability. I don't think there's any doubt. I don't think we'll ever see more than a handful of nations able to field these strategic armed drones, but China's certainly going to be one of them.
And so do you think this decision to go through established legal procedures for dealing with this drug gang, do you think that was a decision based on political grandstanding to one-up the U.S. in public opinion, or do you think it was actually reflective of like a deeper strategic commitment by China to kind of following the laws of war?
I mean, there is, international human rights law evolved out of the Second World War, out of, going back even further to Geneva Conventions. I mean, a lot of states have faith in IHRL, in the laws of war, and a lot of states are concerned by any nation seem to be undermining that. China has placed it. I mean, if you think back, I can't think of a conflict China has been involved in my lifetime. It is, we think of China as the enemy, but it doesn't actually engage itself in conflicts in the way that we do. I say we by the United Kingdom, which is all the United States. So they seem to have a genuine commitment to IHRL. But maybe that will change further down the line. But right now, as I say, they seem to be able to, there are strategic advantages to both China and Russia making trouble for the US right now on the international stage, which is interesting, I think. Yes, sir.
You mentioned drones being used for reconnaissance. Do you have a sense for what portion of their intelligence is driven by reconnaissance that they gather, how much of it is human sources, how much of it is collection by agencies like the NSA?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, it's not just the CIA. It's NSA is involved. what was NEMA, I can't remember the acronym, NGA, now National Geospatial Agency, which does all of the mapping. Phenomenal resources are going into these operations. So for example, we know that the CIA has individually geo-tagged every single building in entire towns in Waziristan and has then 3D modeled them. So when they do carry out a strike, and then all the intelligence is then locked onto those individual properties, and phenomenally sophisticated resources going in. And in fact, some of the operators told me that initially the drones were simply about the missiles and the cameras. But as time has gone on, the pods slung under the wings of the drones and in the nose have gotten more and more sophisticated, gathering more and more data that even the operators are sometimes not allowed to look at. And I spoke with special forces operators who told me that they were sent on missions where halfway through the mission they were ordered to turn around in their seats and face the wall for hours because they weren't allowed to look at what their own equipment was gathering below. There's a figure I give in the book about the Hubble Space Telescope and just the vast quantities of data that are sucked up by what's called intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance on the modern battlefield. The Air Force is pulling the same amount of data every 2 days now off the battlefield as it took the Hubble Space Telescope 24 years to gather on the universes. That's how much they're getting. Whether they're able to filter through that, I don't know. They're almost overwhelmed by the data. I think the missing picture of the jigsaw is the human intelligence, which you really rightly mentioned. That's the most dangerous bit of the drone wars. We talk about them being risk-free, but hundreds of actual and alleged spies, people working for us, have been killed on the ground by terror and militant organizations. Because sometimes the only way you can get to the bad guys is to get a person in to plant that tracking device on the person or on the vehicle at great personal risk to these individuals. And unfortunately, many people have been killed as a consequence. Al-Qaeda in Yemen even crucifies now spies, those people it claims are spies, when it finds them. Sometimes we just see the Taliban, for example, lashing out and killing. There was one that really disturbed me, actually, where they found, the Taliban stumbled upon the fact that the US was using infrared trackers on the underside of vehicles. I guess somebody turned on the night vision on a domestic camcorder, and then suddenly they saw pulse, and they killed every car mechanic in a 4-village radius because they thought the car mechanics were involved in this process. I mean, it just arbitrary killing. And I give an estimate in the book, I think by about 2009, 100 or so-called spies have been killed in Waziristan and maybe double that across the border in Afghanistan. So a very, very risky business. Sometimes the surveillance from the air just isn't enough, and you need the people on the ground, and those people are the ones really taking the risks. I think the other issue is risk displacement as well. We talk about risk warfare, risk-free warfare. Often with these strikes, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, because they can't retaliate against the United States, they will lash out at those they can reach. And we'll see terrorist atrocities against the local police, against military forces and against civilian populations. So I think, again, we have to be careful when we talk about risk-free warfare. There isn't anything like risk-free warfare, but someone somewhere is going to pay that price. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing a lot of displacement of violence in response to the way that we're now fighting war. Yes?
You mentioned that Israel also has a drone capacity. What kind of coordination is there between the U.S. and the Israeli government when it comes to drone usage?
Great question, and there's a whole chapter in the book which you can read and find that out. Yeah, Israel is really interesting. Officially, you will not find a picture of an armed Israeli drone, although we know that Israel has been carrying out drone strikes since 2004. It's still a highly classified project within Israel. Journalists in Israel, it's still unlawful for a journalist in Israel to mention the Israeli armed drone program. They get around that by talking about the New York Times says that we have an armed, that's how Israelis get around it. So everybody knows they have them. And I looked at the parallels between the Israeli and the American targeted killing programs in the book. And I went off and talked to some very senior former Israel Defense Force officials for the book who were very helpful. Interesting, actually. So Israel's targeted killing program began slightly before the United States. Really, it began around November 2000 with the Second Intifada, the Second Palestinian Uprising. Israel had always assassinated. It had always been something that Israel did, but it was ad hoc. What happened with the Intifada was it became more formalized, and they began systematically killing. And one of the senior IDF lawyers told me a great story where they were about 5 or 6 kills in before his general came to him and said, "Is it legal?" Which I think is interesting. There were not really the crossovers between the American and the Israeli programs that I was expecting, actually. And officials on both sides told me there wasn't really, they were aware of each other's programs, but there wasn't really that sharing of information, partly because they were doing it differently. The Israelis didn't get armed drones until about 3 years after the United States had weaponized drones. But I think also because Israel decided to take a very different approach. They chased their drone program all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court deliberately. They wanted the Israeli Supreme Court to engage on the question of legality, and they got a ruling, which was that the strikes were neither lawful nor unlawful in Israeli law. It's an interesting ruling. What the Israeli Supreme Court basically said is you can't have a blanket yes or a blanket no on targeted killings. You have to judge each case according to the laws of war. And that's the current Israeli position. The US, in contrast, has blocked the engagement of the courts at every single opportunity on the targeted killing program. So every time federal courts have tried to examine the legality of the US program, the Department of Justice has intervened and blocked. So we actually have the Israeli position very transparent in terms of the law, the American position very opaque. We have the assertion of the Obama administration that the strikes are lawful, but they won't share with us the evidence on which they've made those findings. So, yeah, I mean, the Israelis still use armed drones, they still carry out targeted killings, but they would argue that theirs are constitutionally legally permissible, which is interesting. Yes, sir.
So, Bush started the war in Iraq, but Obama used more drones. How you compare them?
Yeah, Bush started the war in Iraq. Yes. And by Obama used more drones, you mean in Iraq or
No, generally,
just generally? Yeah.
Was more killer instinct or something, kill Osama bin Laden, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Obama is more militant in a sense. Different way than Bush.
I think it's, I mean, there's a sort of strange media construct of Obama that you sometimes see. The new BBC North America correspondent a couple of months back ran a piece about Obama, which he headlined, The Reluctant Warrior. And I just thought, it's a very strange thing to say about, you can say many things about Obama, but you can't describe him as a reluctant warrior. Yes, I think Obama fights wars in different ways to Bush. And for Obama, it's about the narrow engagements rather than these massive engagements. The drone is very dominant in that narrative, and more broadly, this idea of the air war. But I think also different times. I mean, you know, Bush didn't have to contend with the Arab Spring and everything that has come after that. And I think, you know, both presidents, it's quite hard to measure them against each other because I think they were dealing with different things. So that's a bit of a cop-out answer, I'm afraid. Yes, sir.
So, does the U.S. see this state of legal indeterminacy as being sort of something that can be sustained indefinitely, or is there some kind of maybe like, you know, diplomatic groundwork being laid for some kind of, you know, international legal distinction there,
Yeah.
or is it just that they it's not a question that, you know, that they're willing to entertain?
I think it's a question they won't be willing to entertain until they entertain it. In a way that I mean, you talk to officials in the administration, they're very clear. In their view, these strikes are lawful. I think when American officials talk about lawful, though, they're primarily interested in domestic legality. So long as these are lawful under domestic law, I think American officials are reasonably comfortable. And when the new general counsel to the CIA was being sworn in last year, I forget her name for a moment, but she gave a very interesting comment to the Senate Intelligence Committee, where she was asked about the CIA and customary international law. And she basically said at the end of the day, the US or the CIA and its actions will breach customary international law if need be, but the bit that's the immovable bit is domestic law. And I think that was quite honest, actually. I think that's where we are with the drones at the moment. Officials are aware that this is creating problems, that it is setting precedents that perhaps the US doesn't want to be setting. But right now, the comfort zone is so long as domestic law is being fulfilled, they're prepared to live with that. Yes?
If there see the expansion of Israeli drone strikes into Syria along the southern border, if ISIS does have, if they do start establishing bases or gaining strength? I mean, right now, they just recently had an outbreak, but it's still a very small group.
In Gaza.
Fight against that.
Yeah.
But if the rebels can't contain that, do you see that they would possibly use drones to expand into it?
I don't think that Israel has ever been particularly held back. There was a report just yesterday, the Sudanese government, for example, accused Israel of carrying out a drone strike. That's about the fourth or fifth time we've had Israeli drones reportedly carrying out strikes. We've had reports of Israeli drone strikes in the Negev, sorry, not Negev, in Egypt, the Sinai. We know that Israel has carried out drone strikes in Lebanon. It's likely it's carried out drone strikes in Syria against Hezbollah targets. So I wouldn't see any issue for the Israelis. I mean, the challenge for Israel is what they do with ISIS if it's on Palestinian soil. I think that, if Israel thinks it's got a problem with Hamas, ISIS is a whole other issue. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Won't the picture change when other entities, nations or terrorist groups or whatnot, get the ability to strike the American heartland, submarine off the coast, surface for a short period, send a drone to New York or Washington and sink under the water? If we're in that situation, won't our attitudes to the legality of everything begin to change? We're just early in the history of drone war.
You're absolutely right. And when you speak to anyone involved in the drone programs, they often make the comparison. We're just at those couple of years after the Wright brothers invented, aircraft. I mean, that's how early on we are in this. I don't think we're ever going to see the United States threatened by these big strategic drones. We don't see other nations sending fighters or bombers or cruise missiles at the US. And we're not going to have drones, the big strategic drones coming either, I don't think, because it's an act of war. I think the threat is actually the small tactical drones, where we're seeing this great surge of development of drones at the moment. The ones that are dangerous are the ones you can go and buy at Radio Shack and run off your iPhone, and there are these new technologies called swarm technologies at the moment, for example. That's the terror risk, I think. But in terms of the enemy using drones against the United States.
Out to the distant future, 50 years from now?
I'm so bad at predicting. I can barely predict next week on drones at the moment. I'm conscious that I've been running on, and these have been fantastic questions. Thank you very, very much, everyone, for coming along this evening. I'm going to say Seminary Co-op Bookstore is here tonight, and thank you very much for coming along. And you can buy the book, and I will sign the book for you. So please do. And there's lots of food over there and drink, I see, as well. So I hope everyone's going to stay and chat. And please come, and if there's any questions I didn't catch, then come and have a chat when we're finished. Thank you very much.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.